I've been to churches on every continent except Antarctica. But I've never been to a church like that before. I was in Lima, Peru. I'd heard about places like it, but like most global things, my touchstone has always been Disneyland. It's true. And in this case, it was actually Pirates of the Caribbean, where a skull and crossbones marked the entry spot to an underground world of pirates and skeletons. You're all at least familiar with that, right? Well, in Peru, the church above ground looked like many other churches I visited before. There it is. But below was the catacomb. I entered the large church with pews like any other. But as I wound down deep into the bowels of the church, I discovered a crypt like nothing I'd ever seen or even imagined. Hundreds, thousands of bones were strewn below, skull upon skull, arranged in a mosaic of patterns or gathered by bone type in large holes in the ground. It was dark and damp down there, and I have to admit it was scary. Another tourist actually threw up nearby. Her stomach couldn't handle it. I saw others turning around and making a run for it. I guess there was a part of me that was just like singing, yo ho, yo ho. Because that was the only context I could relate to. Seriously. That, and I'm pretty sure humor was the best way for me to survive because it was hard for me. It was kind of creepy. Let's say a couple of those. That. More? Is there another couple more or no? Is that it? And yet I was fascinated. This was unreal. So I said a prayer and I found myself completely in awe of the people who wanted so desperately to be buried in the catacumbas del convento de San Francisco. But in reality, it was pretty foreign to me. Did we get through all those? There you go. There's another one of it. Years later, I spent an extended period of time, you can go back to me for a second, in Prague for a sabbatical and some medical treatment. And on the advice of my friend, our pastor emeritus actually, the Reverend Dr. Paul Tellstrom, we went to Kutna Hora and visited another special church, the Sedlak Ossuary, a small church known to tourists as the Bone Church. Again, it was unreal. I think there may have been more bones than in Lima, but I'm not sure. There were so many, I just couldn't count either of them. So we were told that the ossuary contained the bones of anywhere between 40,000 and 70,000 people. They weren't just dumped in either. Look at this. Nor were they arranged by bone type like a lot of them were. They were artistically designed. Upon the entrance, there were bones that signified a welcome. In the center of the church, there was this huge hanging chandelier made entirely of human remains. At one spot, there was a coat of arms. It was truly incredible. Can you stick this coat of arms there? I thought I had it. Is the next one a coat of arms? There we go. Look at that. It was so creative. It was so strange. It was really, honestly spooky for me. But I also had to admit, it was pretty beautiful. You could see a couple more here. Just as I felt in Peru, I was inclined to laugh a little, both because it was such an incredible sight, but probably also to alleviate my nerves. It wasn't quite as scary for me as the dark crypt in Peru. This was actually light and bright, and it was cheery, in fact. You see Molly over there. She's just like, hey, I'm hanging out with these skulls. But it was really strange. So how does it make you feel? Oh? You're like, I don't really know, Pastor Sarah. Why did you do this to us? Is it squeamish? Morbid? Fascinating? Yes, yeah. Thank you for responding. Well, maybe you were like me and your mind kind of went to Pirates of the Caribbean because that's like my only context. Maybe the Haunted Mansion. No. Everything I've ever left the country, I always touchstone back to Disneyland because that's all we knew here. Well, in our world, we usually think of skulls and bones as scary things, right? Or even tough stuff. I think about like motorcycle, Sons of Anarchy kind of thing. They're got their skull and crossbones on their jackets. It's kind of scary. It's spooky. It's the stuff of Halloween. If we do see it, we think it's kind of meant to scare us. We don't really feel comfortable. Does anybody here feel comfortable with that? If they got the jacket on at home? I think that's because all of that reminds us of death, and it doesn't seem like something we would welcome. Death's uncomfortable. I remember when I was in college, I was taking an Eastern religions class, and I learned about Buddhist monks who would practice a meditation that would involve walking towards and staring at death, and there were these actual bones involved that they would walk towards. And it freaked me out. I didn't know why. It kind of grossed me out too, to be honest with you. I felt like there was no need to focus so much on death. After all, we're called to live, right? Why focus on death? And there's a big part of me that feels that way today still. As a Protestant, I'm a wasp here. I have never felt all that comfortable with things like the crucifix. I don't like seeing Jesus and his bloody body hanging on a cross. As a kid, I thought it was really scary. Going into a Roman Catholic church for me was scary. And as an adult, my Christology has been so centered on Jesus' life and his ministry, I'm not really focused on Jesus' death. Because I don't have an atonement theology, as you know. I don't think that Jesus died for my sins, and therefore I'm not really hung up on Jesus having a gory death. So I don't find myself glorifying it. For me, the crucifixion is a gory reminder of the evil of our world. I do think it's something that we must face. There's power in this. Maundy Thursday is one of the most powerful nights of the year for me. But I don't have death or the crucifixion as the central tenet of my faith. If you've hung around long enough, you probably know that I'm here for the meal, the heel and the meal, right? Jesus teaching, loving, walking for justice. But I also would say that I've had some incredibly sacred experiences with death, holy, beauty. But in general, I don't think of death as a joyful thing. It's not, I recognize that there are times when death is something to welcome, especially if there's been a long illness and suffering. But even then, I feel that there's some holy sadness, perhaps. It may not be joyful, but there is sacred sadness in it. But when it's welcome, it can be welcomed, but not necessarily joyful. That somebody could actually become a bone artist, that's just beyond me. And the artwork, how did they think of that? I'm still jaw-dropping years later. So that's why I'm going to confess that I did not get Dia de los Muertos. It took me a long time to get there. I thought it was strange. I thought it was maybe even rude. This in-your-face thing. People might have been trying to offend us. That's how I felt. Or scare us with skeletons. It's only been in the last, decade and a half or so that I've really come to appreciate it. During this time, it's become more of a part of our larger culture. Mexicans, particularly, it's a Mexican tradition, but Latinos have reclaimed the tradition, have mainstreamed it, and sometimes us white folks have appropriated it a bit. I prefer to say we appreciate it now. I wasn't comfortable with it, but I also wasn't very comfortable with those bone churches. And yet, I found an appreciation and importance that when we're squirming about something, we have to ask ourselves, why am I so uncomfortable? Why am I turning off from this? Why was I more comfortable judging Dia de los Muertos than I was in understanding it? Why was I more comfortable laughing in those churches and all those designs, even still, than I am in embracing them? So we don't need to unpack the symbols because they're obvious. Bones equals death. And we're just not all that comfortable with death, or at least I'll speak for myself. Even as a pastor who deals with death, I live in a culture that has enculturated me to not be comfortable with death. It shouldn't be a surprise to us. We know that as Americans, we have anesthetized death. It used to be that people died in their homes. We're not that many generations removed from that. I don't know if anybody remembers that happening on a regular basis. Now, the majority of us die outside of the home, despite the fact that most people say they want to die at home. The statistics are that only 60% of Americans actually die in a hospital, in an acute care hospital. 20% will die in a step down, a SNF, a nursing home. And only 20% will get to die in their homes. And I think that even though we want that, our culture still seems to kind of push us away from it. We want to put it somewhere else. Even property values will drop, right? You have to disclose if somebody died in your home. So it's like a bad thing. We want to keep death away from us. And I suppose that if we only associate death with horror movies, or, this pivotal change within a movie, then I get why. And despite my own admission of discomfort, I'm also so fascinated. I'm fascinated by a culture that would embrace these churches, that would desire for their bones to be a part of these artistic designs or to be buried in these catacombs. I've become truly enchanted with Dia de los Muertos, and the beauty and the delight that people find in dressing up as skeletons and decorating sugar skulls. I think Coco's had a lot to do with that, helped shift the narrative. I've preached about Coco before. I love the theology there. Here in Orange County, in downtown Santa Ana, they have El Centro de Mexico puts on Noche de Altares. Has anybody ever been to that in downtown Santa Ana? Happened last night. Every year it gets bigger. There's more and more Latino people from the community that come, and others who aren't Latino are drawn to it by this festivity and the reverence that it invokes. And I feel that I am now one of those people who is drawn to it in a new way. It's still foreign to me, and I can come with it with that, but where once I was afraid or offended a piece of me, to be honest, or even repulsed or just plain old ignorant, now I'm drawn to it. I love that the intention is not actually to scare, but it is to find joy. Both Halloween and Day of the Dead are rooted in the same history, but Halloween has largely lost its spirituality and connection to the church. It's a big capitalized holiday here. It's rarely theologized unless you come right here on a spooky Sunday like you did last week. Halloween tends to focus on the fear of our mortality, right? And get in there with the fear and the spookiness of this unknown. But Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, puts all its focus on death, but instead of treating it as something scary, it's approached with joy. And that's a little odd for some of us. So last night, it happened again in Santa Ana. It was clear that this is a festive occasion with dancing and music and joy, that this is a day to connect with our dead and to not only remember them, but also to recognize their presence with us now. Some will say that Dia de los Muertos is a day to recognize that death is merely a continuation of life, that our dead are among us. And so instead of trying to push this day away and to push death away, the day desires to bring us closer to death. And I think that's so funny because we're usually trying to run from it. I mean, everything in our society is like, can I run from this as fast as I can, from aging and getting old? I mean, we don't even call the day, our day, Day of the Dead. We call it All Saints Day or All Souls Day because we want to euphemize it. We want to keep ourselves away from dead. We don't want to be dead. But even in our own tradition, embedded in our own tradition, is the very day that Mexicans are celebrating, that the ancient churches of old in Peru, in the Czech Republic, they've sought to experience this Day of the Dead, this All Saints Day, this All Souls Day, to recognize that there is something beyond this. We don't understand it. Maybe we're not exactly comfortable staring death in the face, but this morning we've made our altar into an altar similar to La Noche de Altares. It's not quite as colorful, but these altars remind us that we can live with death in life. And so they're here this morning. One of the things I love about the day is that it's annual. It happens every year. When somebody dies in our life, we recognize the pain of our loss, but this gives us an opportunity to name our dead with the reality that death does affect us daily. It doesn't go away after a couple weeks or a few months. We act as though it doesn't linger, right? We give ourselves this amount of time where we will recognize the loss of our friends and, or of a friend who's experiencing death in their life, and we'll check in, but then we go on to other things and we move on. Whereas those of us who are living with the memory of our loved ones, we still live with that daily. We just don't talk about it as a culture. We want to keep death away from us, but it never is. So when we observe days like this, we name what we inwardly know. Our dead are with us. They are among us. I don't know the mystery of what happens when we die, but I know what it's like to live with the dead, to have a dead dad. I recognize that his death is with me and has marked me, has been with me almost my whole life now, over 3 decades. Sometimes more powerfully than other times, this World Series. My Dodger dad was ever so present. I put on the altar next to his picture is a Dodger hat. I know that he is with me in a way I cannot fully explain, but I felt his presence so powerfully. That struck that one out, and we won. I was like, Dad, we did it! He's with me. Our dead are with us. They are always with us. And so we pause to remember our saints, to call upon all souls, to open ourselves up to the presence of death among us and without fear. Maybe, yes, with sadness, but without the fresh sting of death. We can face it. We can embrace it. We can thank God for our dead and maybe even share in joy. Hoy es nuestro Día de los Muertos. Today is our Day of the Dead. We remember you. We experience you. We live with you still. Now we're going to remember this day of our dead.